This is such an important question. What is trauma? There are actually a couple of different definitions. If you're looking at the old medical model, they will define trauma as the event itself. It was the event, it was the assault that happened to you. It was the, parents' neglect that happened to you. What we've come to understand, those who are the most successful in working with people with trauma around the world, understand that it's not the event that is the trauma. It's our perception of the event and the story that we create around the event that creates the trauma inside of our body, right? That's why, a perfect example would be when you have like the five soldiers and they're all inside of the military vehicle and they run over a landmine, right? And they all end up having massive injuries. And, you know, two out of the five end up having massive PTSD trauma afterwards, but the other three are able to move on. Why is that? They all experienced and saw the exact same thing. Why is it that three of them are okay and the other two are not? It's because of the perception, how they perceived what happened to them and the story that they created around it. It literally rewires your entire neurology, how you see yourself, how you see the world around you. It rewires your belief systems. And when that happens, that can either hinder you or that can help you and create more wisdom for future learnings.
I heard a couple years ago, I think it might have been Jason Silva who explained things this way. And he was talking about the expression neurons that fire together, wire together, which is a sort of classic expression in neuroscience. And what that means is essentially pathways of the brain. I'm explaining to listeners, I obviously assume you know Dr. Villanueva. But it means that pathways in the brain that are repetitively stimulated essentially get stronger. So in the same way that if you go to the gym and you do lots of bicep curls, your biceps going to get stronger as a result of that. Over time, you're stimulating those pathways and strengthening them. That happens in our brain to some extent too. It's in the form of neurons that if they're stimulated, then they get stimulated more easily, essentially. And we typically conceptualize that expression, neurons that fire together, wire together, as sort of something akin to weightlifting or exercise training, that it's, repetitive stimuli over time train the brain to be better at something. And that's true. But the way that he was talking about trauma is essentially that with a sufficient enough intensity of the experience, you can almost get that neurons wiring together effect essentially instantaneously. And I'm wondering what your take on that is. So like, how do you conceptualize what's going on in the context of trauma? Like, for example, in the case of the example you just gave, what's going on neurologically that's different between the people who either were or were not traumatized?
That's what I like to call the amygdala hijack. And I've spoken on many stages about this, and I love it when I get an opportunity to actually show slides and show pictures of how this neural rewiring happens. But even without pictures, it's fairly easy to explain. The amygdala hijack is basically explaining how the nervous system and the brain in particular rewires itself when the person is confronted with a heightened emotional experience where they perceive something that's dangerous or scary, or just something that is really really negative that could hurt them. And so let me explain it like this. In our brain, I'm going to keep this super super simple. In our brain, when we are perceiving things around us, we have a couple of parts of our brain that often get stimulated, one being one more than the other in a healthy brain. And that would be what I will call the frontal cortex. So right here over the forehead area, there's a large area of the brain. I'll call that the frontal cortex. And in general, what that does is that helps us to think logically, so that we can MacGyver our way out of a crazy situation if we need to. We can think of all possibilities, right? It helps us to control our impulses. Let's say that, some guy cuts us off in the road, and we may have the impulse to go sock him in the face, poke him in the eyes because, "Oh, you just ran me off the road and almost killed me." But what do? Our frontal lobe thinks about the consequences of that. Well, you know what? I'm just going to let that guy go. That guy was a jerk, and I'm just going to keep on going. So it helps us with inhibition, right? So that we can control and really figure out, like, if I do this, this could happen. This is the consequences. And it does many other things, but the main thing here is that it helps us to think rationally, to come up with rational decisions, to think logically. And then you've got another part of your brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is a small, primitive area of the brain that's more deeply rooted in the center of the brain. And it really only gets it really only gets triggered or activated whenever we have a heightened emotional experience that we perceive as dangerous, right? Something that's dangerous or scary or a threat. And so in a healthy brain, when you see, hear, feel, smell a threat, you get wiring, right, from what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're smelling, what you're touching or feeling that's threatening. The message, you start getting these alarms that will go into the amygdala to turn on that fight or flight center. And then you'll also have some messages that'll go to the frontal lobe so that it can start reasoning through it. Is this really a danger? What do I need to do? Do I need to go around? What do I need to do? And then you'll have some neurological pathways that go in between the frontal lobe and the amygdala, so that the amygdala is going, danger, 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 and the frontal lobe can go, yes, I see that it's danger, but we can avoid it by going around, or we can do this, or no, it's not really a danger anymore. That's the healthy brain. But when an individual gets re-exposed, like, perfect example is what's happened over the last 20 months. People who are digging for information all the time, watching the news all the time, where it's all this fear-based. There is very specific language, and I teach about this in my recent trauma masterclass that I did. I teach about how language can be used right under our noses. Language can be used to put people into a state of amygdala hijack, where it rewires their brain, literally brainwashing them, because it's happening. The messages that we're watching on television are very threatening. They're very scary. Okay. Everything that we hear over and over and over and over and over, when we keep getting these repeated messages of danger going to the amygdala, firing up the amygdala all the time, when it should be like sleeping most of the time, our brain pathways, our neurological pathways suddenly rewire. And instead of having most of the pathways going to the frontal lobe so that you can logically think through a situation, you lose those pathways. And most of the pathways are now going to the fight or flight center of the amygdala. And there's hardly any pathways going from the amygdala to the frontal lobe, so that the frontal lobe can help reason through it and let us know when the danger is over. So we, in essence, rewire our brain to get stuck in this state of fight or flight, stuck in this state of literal terror. And our bodies go into that fight or flight state, and we can't come out of it. So now we've got raging anxiety. We think the world's coming to an end. Even when we try to think logically, like everything's okay, our brain has already been rewired. So now our body is still in fight or flight. Our body thinks that something bad's going to happen all the time, even when your brain is trying to say, calm everything down. This is what happens. This is a perfect example of what's happened in the last 20 months. Our brains have been rewired to stay in a perpetual state of fight or flight, a perpetual state of terror. And so what do we do about that? This is why we're seeing an increase in suicide. This is why we're seeing an increase in overdose, in deaths from overdoses. People have been brainwashed. They can't think logically. Now, even when they try to access their frontal lobe, the amygdala has literally grown like the muscle when you're working out all the time. That amygdala has grown. The frontal lobe literally shrinks down. And now the fight or flight center is in charge, and you can't think logically. So, what do we do about that? This is a huge, huge problem.
Let's talk about the nervous system.
Yeah.
That's the thing that you've been focused on for the last few years now, is what's going on in the body when we've got a nervous system and a brain under chronic stress. So tell me what's going on. And obviously there's different lenses and paradigms through which one can look at this story, from a sort of purely neuroscience perspective, or a hormonal perspective, or a biochemistry perspective, or a mitochondrial perspective, or a whatever, or a vagus nerve perspective, or these kinds of things. So what is kind of the paradigm that you have landed on as far as what you feel is most insightful?
Yeah, and all of those things that you mentioned are so incredibly important. And my roots have always been in gut health, and I know you know that. And the more I progressed, it's like, okay, well, yeah, I always said a million times, all disease begins in the gut, right? But I really have started to see how all disease begins in the nervous system, and modern life has changed so much. And so really what kind of got me shifted into this is seeing, when I was in private practice, 15 years ago, we didn't see a ton of SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And then you start to see more and more and more and more. And now even in our gut program, it's almost 50%. And so now we're seeing that over 50% of SIBO is actually hypothyroid-induced SIBO from dropping the gut-brain-brain-gut connection. And that's as a result of chronic prolonged stress, right? So the adrenals have been over-secreting cortisol. We've 60 different types of cortisol and adrenaline is being released, and that's then suppressing thyroid function, because they're a team, these two glands. The thyroid has to give up, right? It stops converting thyroid hormone in the gut. And now we just started to see such an onslaught of SIBO. And the more we started testing, it's like, wow, this is hypothyroid induced, but where's the hypothyroidism coming from? Oh, it's coming from stress, right? And so it all goes back to the nervous system, and living in fight or flight has become so normal and so commonplace, this sympathetic, just living in sympathetic dominance to get things done. And for a while, it feels good, right? You feel driven, you feel focused, you feel productive, you feel on top of the world. And then the bottom drops out. And so much of this I approach, not necessarily from a neuroscience perspective, but just from the emotional perspective, that then you don't know who you are anymore. You can't make decisions. You are overwhelmed all of the time, with really little things. And you're kind of going through this alternating anxiety and depression. And so I equate it to a car. If you filled a car with gas, and then all of a sudden you're driving, and then you take all the gas away, right? Like quickly. And like, that's going to be a really bumpy ride home. And then you put just a little bit in and you're sputtering. Like a normal drive home, which you wouldn't even think about, has now become such a stressful experience. And that's what the vast majority of our planet, especially in the last few years since the pandemic, keeps marching toward, living in this state of sympathetic dominance. Their myelin sheath, that protective coating around their nerve cells, is damaged. And we're seeing so much early onset Alzheimer's and dementia. I mean, I remember you and I talking about that at lunch. So much of this is completely avoidable with how we take care of ourselves, and how we take care of specifically our adrenals and our thyroid, because the adrenals are the gas tank of the body. I don't need to tell you that. And the thyroid is the furnace and the thermostat. And so hormonal balance begins in the brain. So I think if we can approach the nervous system from regulating the availability of fuel for the body, storing energy once again in the cells, creating safety, and then repairing from the neurotransmitters in the brain, then we get hormonal balance from the top down, which is the best way to live a really fulfilling life. You get to be yourself versus okay, like I'm a little high in this, I'm a little low in this, let's take some progesterone, let's patch it with testosterone. And a lot of times that's almost like taking away someone's inherent personality versus refilling them and allowing them to operate from there.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is that most people think that a trauma is an event that then changes your thoughts and changes your reactions. And so then you find yourself reacting to the event that happened in your past. And that's actually not true. So a trauma is the experience of something, and whether that's an event or whether that was a whole period of your life, like your whole childhood. I don't know about your childhood, Ari, right? So I'm not going to put that on you right now. I'm just saying, for some people, right? Like for some people, it's just like, no, it's just like the whole family dynamics. Like all of that was traumatic. And what is trauma? So trauma is anything that for any reason at that time overwhelmed our biology, our physiology to meet that stress, and it overwhelmed us. It crushed us, and it left us in a state where we didn't know if we were going to make it. And the way that we made it through that was to just kind of go into ourselves and just kind of, it's like the turtle that puts its head inside of its shell. And it's just like, I'm going to just survive by just kind of tucking in and going into this low energy metabolic state. We call it the chronic freeze state or the dorsal vagal response. And that's how we got through. And so when we look at, wait a second, trauma is not then just your belief system coming out of an event. It was actually how your biology responded in the moment, and trauma leaves those lasting effects on your biology. And so the thoughts are actually just the downstream effect of your biology. And so when we look at, hey, how are we going to get ourselves out of me still reacting to my past? Well, it's actually more work on the biology than the psychology, which is where your work becomes really important.
Mm-hmm.
Because trauma is actually an energy problem.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. Okay. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, because if we're saying that for any reason, the biology, the physiology got overwhelmed, it's because it did not have the cellular resources to meet the stress, to meet those demands at that time.
That's interesting that you conceptualize resilience in the same way that I do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've heard me talk on that topic, but as far as how mitochondria relate to resilience and something I call the resilience threshold, and how that in turn relates to like cellular energy producing capacity. That's really interesting that you bring that up, because almost universally when I speak to somebody who's talking about, I know you literally just tried to take this out of the psychological realm, but just for ease of speaking about it, when I speak to someone who's talking about trauma and kind of more psychological stuff, trapped emotions, things of that nature, I find that almost universally they have a purely psychological or neurological way of conceptualizing that, where it's really cut off and disconnected from the rest of the body. So I love where this is going thus far, that you have a more holistic integration with physiology, biology more broadly, rather than just the purely psychological or neurological.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so much richness here and so much depth to this, because exactly what you say, like trauma is actually creating a disconnect between our mind, what we associate as our mind and our thoughts, and our body and our physiology. And we can even see then how we develop bracing patterns to cut off sensations coming from our body up to our brainstem and thus our mind. And it's almost it's our nervous system, right? Some people want to call it the unconscious mind or the whatever. It's the autonomic nervous system. And so it makes these decisions for us for how it can best help us survive in life. And so these bracing patterns, and there's a lot that happens even just here in the thoracic inlet, a lot of jaw type of stuff, because, like when you don't want to feel something, you just clench your jaw. When you don't want to say something that might offend people, just clench your jaw, right? Like it helps us hold things in. And that's exactly what happens on so many levels. So when we look at, what's happening on the cellular level, I talk a lot about the capacity. I heard you use that word as well, the capacity of the system to hold stress and not let it overwhelm us. And then we talk about anything that it does not have that capacity for, then our nervous system is making decisions about, how do I still help you survive given all that you have going on in your life, given that you can't fall apart, given that you still have kids to take care of, and you've still got to get food on the table, and you've got to show up for them, and you have all these life responsibilities, so I can't let you fall apart. And so then there's these mechanisms, coping mechanisms, even internally, that develop in order to help us still keep going, even though there's a part of us that is very much disconnected.
Okay, that is well, the last thing you said there is actually a perfect segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you. So I often conceptualize the body's responses as, I think it's important to frame things as from the perspective of the intelligence of the body. What is the body trying to accomplish by doing this? So as an example, fatigue is something I talk a lot about.
Yep.
As an intelligent, adaptive response in certain
Yes.
contexts.
Yes.
In contexts where the environment is perceived to be very harsh, in the context of a pathogen, and you've got an acute infection, you've got a physical injury. We have mechanisms where the increased immune activation and inflammation that results in those scenarios literally engages mechanisms at the mitochondrial level, at the neurological level, where our body is designed to respond to that with fatigue. And I emphasize to people that this is not a mistake. Our body is designed to do this because it's intelligent, because it's adaptive, and it actually it lowers your subjective energy, so you're less inclined to do your normal routines and go for a jog or go work hard at work all day and just keep pushing and go. And instead, it's forcing you to rest so that it can shift resources towards repairing and healing that. Now, in the context of trauma, I'm really curious to see how you position trauma, like let's say severe trauma, kind of in that sort of frame. And what I mean by that is should this be seen as, when somebody has a severe trauma, is that an intelligent, adaptive response to the scenario that they were in, or is this a sign of dysfunction? Is this the body gone wrong and it's in a state of dysfunction that we need to heal? How do you conceptualize that?
This is one of my favorite topics, Ari. So in terms of when we see the fatigue through the lens of trauma, fatigue is the dorsal vagal response. Fatigue is the trauma response. It's not just an adaptation, it is the trauma response. And so what I teach in my courses is, you've got the 3 states of the nervous system. That's also a misconception because people often just think of parasympathetic and then your fight, flight, or freeze and just lump them into 2. And no, there's 3 categories, and the freeze response is that fatigue that's going to be a part of that. And there's some other conditions that are very much part of that freeze response or the trauma response: autoimmunity, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, but chronic fatigue is right there. And the reason for that is that when there's this very sequential neurobiological response to trauma, and it's the design of the system. So anytime that a person experiences any form of trauma, even what they might consider small traumas, it doesn't matter. Trauma is trauma. It's all the same response because there's only one response to trauma that the body has. And that response always includes this freeze response, which is the dorsal vagal response, and it goes into a energy conservation state in order to survive. And so the first response to a stress or a threat or a sense of danger is always the sympathetic response. Some people, Ari, from childhood were already experiencing so much internal stress that they don't hardly spend any time in sympathetic. They just go to that fatigue and that freeze response immediately with any stress. Like any stress is just overwhelming to them, throws them off. And there they go. And they feel that energy drain. that collapse in their system. But going back to the intelligence of the system, that sympathetic response always happens first, and the sympathetic response is a very high energy state. So your mitochondria are working at their maximum, right? Like they're trying to give you as much energy as possible because you got to outrun that tiger, or you got to, I don't know how you outrun an email that's stressing you out, or right? Like don't know how that equates, but
that's part of the problem, right? Is like when the proverbial
that's part of the problem.
That system of the sympathetic response to stress is sort of by definition an acute system. It doesn't work very well when the stressor is drawn out over time.
Exactly. And so this is where trauma is an energy problem, because the trigger for this freeze response, the trauma response, is a word that's called thwarted movement, where your ability to move to action to solve the problem is blocked. And whether that's blocked by external forces, like you're actually trapped in a building or trapped in a car in that type of an event, or you don't have enough internal cellular resources. And so your own system kind of makes that intelligent decision of, we can't maintain this high energy state in order to survive. It's best for us to shut down. But then part of that is this low energy fatigue state. And so that's always the reason. That's always the reason for the trauma response, is what's called the thwarted movement, that blocked ability to move to action. And so then a person has these symptoms of the freeze response. And at that time, Ari, like that was the best decision of the body. And we even look at how this is happening in early childhood and very early development, where a newborn, and for the first several months of life, they actually have no ability to regulate their own system. And so when they go into sympathetic, they have no ability to bring that back down like we do as adults. And whether we're doing it in a healthy way or whether we're doing it in a coping adaptive mechanism like food, alcohol, substances, whatever it is, to kind of calm our system back down, they have no ability to do that for themselves. So if they don't get that through that relationship and co-regulation with their parent, then they are having to use their own brake system and shut the system down, which shuts the mitochondria down, which shuts all of these systems down in order to maintain homeostasis. Because otherwise they would literally die from running out of energy. Like they don't have that ability to kind of regulate themselves. So again, kind of coming back to the fatigue, then, like fatigue is part of every trauma response, because every trauma response is the decision, the intelligent decision at that time, that we're running out of cellular resources and we've got to shut down and conserve energy in order to get through this. And so then you see people struggling with low energy, right? And that's what they're frustrated at. And they think that that's the problem. And that's actually just the downstream effect of the decision that their body has made for how they can best survive this time in their life.
Right. And that's such an important reframe to teach people that they're not just trying to fight against their low energy state. The goal is to understand why their body made that intelligent decision, figure out what triggered the body to make that decision, and then undo whatever's triggering the body into that.
Well, and you just use the word fight, right? Like they don't have the energy to fight. Right.
Yeah.
So when they do feel like they have energy, if they're using that energy to fight their own body, they're running themselves back into that low energy state. And so it is such an important reframe. And that's why I start everybody. I start everybody with that work. We do body work. And we do that work to get into a place of working with the body rather than fighting against the body.